and scare Canadians, pretty much the entire playbook of the Liberal Party of Canada since Justin Trudeau became leader of the party, literally in 2013. It was all about scaremongering. Even before 2013, one can make the argument, going back to the 2004 and 2006 election under PM Martin and Chrétien, the lengths by which they will go to try to paint any leader of the Conservative Party of Canada as a boogeyman. And that Canadians ought to be fearful that there is somehow a hidden agenda, that they will say one thing and quite frankly do another, which really is the playbook of Justin Trudeau and has been since he formed government in 2015. But it's more pronounced now because, let's face it, they're down 20-plus points in the polls. They have been down for well over a year.
Chair.
Go ahead on your point of order.
Just talking about relevance, I'd encourage the member to come back to the topic at hand.
Go ahead,
and
Mr.
relevance
Brock.
is very subjective. As I telegraphed to the party, my speaking remarks are at least 2 hours long. So I will get to relevant points of Ms. Khalid's motion in due course.
Mr. Brock has the floor. Go ahead, Mr. Brock. And I'm not going to accept any interruptions here. We've talked about this many times. Relevance is subjective. Mr. Brock will get to his points and make his points in an appropriate manner, and I don't want any interruptions unless it's related to the actual standing orders, and you can cite those. Go ahead, Mr. Brock.
So before I was interrupted, Chair, I talked about the Liberal Party of Canada's standing amongst the Canadian electorate, and a number of polls have been conducted literally since the day our leader had been elected, and there has been a consistent drive to water down and eliminate that Liberal support. And it's obviously must be extremely disappointing to many longstanding members of the Liberal Party of Canada. It's not surprising that we have a number of ministers who've decided not to run for re-election. We have a number of MPs deciding not to run for re-election. There is a phrase that I'm not going to use, but it's clear that they too look at the polls and they know that public opinion is changing. It's changing for a number of reasons, Mr. Chair. There's always, and always has been, a shelf life for any political party. That applies to the Liberal Party, that applies to the Conservative Party. People get tired of being promised a number of things pre-election merely to buy a vote, and then to be profoundly disappointed when the Prime Minister of the day does not deliver. And that's precisely what's happening with Justin Trudeau. I'm sure he and the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and the entire Finance Department, if not the entire Liberal bench, thought that the spring budget would finally end some negativity towards their economic policies, that they were going to make it fairer for a number of generations, that it wasn't strictly about the middle class. Now it's fairness for multiple generations. But what are we seeing in the budget? We're seeing the same worn-out talking points that Justin Trudeau promised Canadians in 2015 and completely has not delivered on, particularly in the area, in my view, of public safety. And I'm going to get to relevant points in due course. But it's just indicative, emblematic of why this party and its members are just so desperate to find something other than to take a look at their track record. The budget has fallen flat on its face. One could have made the argument that the Prime Minister was going to drop the writ 2 or 3 weeks ago with his cross-country tour and all his ministers following along and delivering all these little goodies as to what they can expect from the budget. But nothing has moved the channel because Canadians are wise and Canadians are intelligent. And they have finally realized that this Prime Minister, who they thought was going to conduct governance so much more differently. Let's all remember his famous words in 2015, how he would do politics different, that his administration would be known as the most transparent, accountable, and responsible government this country has ever seen. But then you take a look at everything that has transpired. Their non-willingness to provide documents at committee, instructing their members to filibuster when it comes to exposing elements of corruption and unethical behavior. The list goes on and on and on. I could spend hours doing a deep dive, just taking a look at the number of scandals that has rocked Justin Trudeau and members of his cabinet, members of his backbench, literally since 2015. Canadians are wise individuals, Mr. Chair, and they remember these things. So with all the good efforts that the Liberal members of this committee are trying to do now, trying to scare Canadians and fearmonger, in my view, is going to fall flat on its face. Let's take, for instance, this whole concept of the scariness of the Notwithstanding clause. The Notwithstanding clause, surprise, surprise, introduced by Justin's father himself, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, well over 40 years ago. And that Notwithstanding clause in the last 40 plus years has not been amended. It has been in the books for a very long time. And while no federal government has exercised its use, does not necessarily mean, in fact, I'll say definitively, does not mean that it's inappropriate to use it in the future. We know that some provincial premiers have used it. You know, and where was the backlash from Justin Trudeau? Well, I guess there was a little bit of backlash. He talked a good game, but he didn't do anything about it. When Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, talked about it, when the Premier of Quebec talked about it, this is something that is law in this country. And for all the non-lawyers on the Liberal bench, I invite them all to take the time, it'll take you less than 2 minutes, to actually read Section 33 of the Charter. That when used, clearly, and I'm just paraphrasing it, when used, it's not permanent. It's reviewable at 5 years. So when we take a look at the comments recently made by our leader, these are comments, Mr. Chair, that have not changed or been altered in any which way from the first moment that he talked about the applicable use of the Notwithstanding clause. The Notwithstanding clause, despite the best efforts of Ms. Khalid to try to open up the floodgates and widen the potential abuse of the Notwithstanding clause to scare Canadians, to be fearful of the use of that clause, because now it might be applied to reproductive rights is an absolute joke, and it's offensive because she knows full well, as does every member of that Liberal bench, where the Conservative Party of Canada stands on that issue. Dead stop. No further discussion needed. But that won't stop the Liberals. That will not stop them. They will continue to scare Canadians into believing that Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre, and yes, I will say it with complete confidence, will be Canada's next great Prime Minister, will use it, if he uses it, and when he uses it, will use it for its stated objective. And his stated objective is to correct a lot of things that are happening in our justice system that is really, really disturbing, not only to members of Parliament, but disturbing to Canadians as a whole. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Bissonnette case, because that really forms the genesis of our discussion regarding the Notwithstanding clause. And I want to read an article from the press. This is dated February the 8th, 2019. And this is some of the important words used by the sentencing judge in Quebec before the government decided to appeal. And the heading reads, Quebec City mosque shooter sentenced to at least 40 years in prison. Judge calls Alexandre Bissonnette's attack an unspeakable tragedy that tore apart our social fabric. Bissonnette, who pleaded guilty to killing 6 men at a Quebec City mosque 2 years ago, will be allowed to ask for parole at the age of 67, a judge decided Friday. Bissonnette, 29, will serve an automatic life sentence for shooting and killing the men at the Quebec Islamic Cultural Centre on January 29, 2017. He has been behind bars since the shooting. He will be allowed to go before the Parole Board of Canada after serving 40 years, ruled Superior Court Justice Francois Roy, in a decision that left survivors and families feeling disappointed, dismayed, and gutted. I'll go back to those words, Mr. Chair. The judge called Bissonnette's attack an unspeakable tragedy that tore apart our social fabric. During a sentencing hearing that lasted nearly 6 hours, the judge read out parts of his 246-page decision, and I'm sure that members of this committee would not like me to start reading all 246 pages, but I'm certainly happy if necessary, to a packed courtroom describing Bissonnette's actions as premeditated, gratuitous, and abject. His crimes were truly motivated by race and a visceral hatred towards Muslim immigrants, the judge said. Bissonnette was emotionless as the judge read out his decision and was quickly escorted out of the courtroom. After a grueling day, survivors like Said El Amari was visibly upset by the outcome. He choked down tears of anger as he spoke outside the Quebec City courtroom. He said, "Today is a sad day. We are committing 17 orphans to 40 years of suffering, at the end of which they will have to show up again to keep this assassin behind bars. That suffering starts today and will last 40 years. I am floored. Amen Derbali, who was hit by 7 bullets and is now paraplegic, said he almost fainted. He almost fainted when he heard the judge's final decision. I would have liked to see justice served today, said Derbali. Megda and Amir Belkacemi, who lost their father in the attack, extended their support to the families of the victims of Bruce MacArthur, who was also sentenced today on 8 counts of first-degree murder with a chance of parole in 25 years. Earlier in the day, Justice Holt did a minute-by-minute run-through of the shooting. And it's important that I read this out because I'm going to compare and contrast to the ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada that deemed this cruel and unusual punishment. Armed with a .223 caliber rifle and a 9mm Glock pistol, Bissonnette was carrying 108 bullets when he entered the Islamic Cultural Center, shooting into the crowded prayer room as Sunday prayers were ending. And again, they've identified the names of those that died, and then 5 others were critically injured. Bissonnette pleaded guilty in March 2018 to 6 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of attempted murder for the men he wounded, and a 6th count of attempted murder for the 35 people present that night, including 4 children. Both the Crown and Bissonnette's lawyers said they have to review the lengthy sentencing decision and would not be commenting. While first-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence, the judge had to decide how long Bissonnette would have to wait before he would seek parole. We all know in 2011, Stephen Harper's Conservative government adopted Article 745.51 to the Criminal Code, which allows a judge to impose consecutive rather than concurrent periods of parole ineligibility for multiple murders. And for the Canadians who are watching these proceedings, and I'm really glad that we are public and not in camera, because Canadians deserve to hear this. Consecutive means just that there was a potential that Bissonnette could have served 25 years for the intentional, premeditated killing of each member of that mosque. 25 times 7. He would have died in prison. He would have been carried out in a box. Concurrent is the opposite. In essence, what the Supreme Court of Canada has done is it's granted legal license to mass murderers, telegraphing to all mass murderers that regardless of the number of victims, regardless how you kill those victims, regardless of your background, you have got a license to mass murder innocent civilians in this country, and you will serve a maximum of 25 years before you're eligible for a chance at parole. Because the wisdom of those 9 judges, not too far from here, at the Supreme Court of Canada, deemed that having a life sentence, that really means a life sentence. These are the words that had been entrenched in the Criminal Code of Canada for decades. a life sentence. Our learned judges of the Supreme Court of Canada found that 40 years, Mr. Chair, not 25 times 7 years, I'll quickly do the math, 35, 175 years. That 40 years was cruel and unusual because it denied this animal, this mass murdering animal, the opportunity to re-victimize every single family member and extended family member of the 7 people that he killed. That I find, as a member of the Ontario Bar, profoundly disappointing. Absolutely profoundly disappointing. I had to think about the Bissonnette decision, Mr. Chair, when I was a member of the Justice Committee. And we were studying victims' rights. It was coincidental at that time, the Bissonnette decision, the Supreme Court of Canada was released. And we invited 2 victims during one particular day of our study. And these victims, I wish I had the transcript so I could actually share the extremely profound language that they used, but their appearance at justice was perhaps a week to 2 weeks following the release of that decision. And I remember one case in particular. I don't know if any members of this committee remember the case, but the accused, now the convicted murderer, was a man by the name of Dylan Millard. And he and another co-accused, also a convicted murderer, decided to answer an ad for a gentleman, a young father who recently got married.